I was the only one who gave the old gardener a glass of water on the hottest day of the year. Everyone else treated him like he was invisible, like he didn't belong in our world. But when he looked at me with those tired eyes and said, "You've always had a kind heart," I had no idea that by nightfall I would discover he wasn't a gardener at all. He was a duke, and the inheritance he was about to change would shatter my family forever. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Storyflow Diaries. I never believed kindness could rearrange an entire bloodline, but that summer proved me wrong. The day it started was suffocatingly hot, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the pavement and presses against your lungs like a heavy hand. My stepmother, Lorraine, was hosting one of her elaborate afternoon luncheons at our estate, a sprawling ancestral property my late father had treasured long before he married her. The gardens were trimmed to perfection, the fountain polished, the white roses in full bloom. It was all very beautiful, very curated, and very false. I was 24 at the time, freshly returned home after finishing university, trying to find my footing in a house that had never truly felt like mine. Lorraine made sure of that. She had 2 daughters of her own, Camille and Brooke, both perfectly styled, perfectly trained to smile at the right people and ignore the wrong ones. And that afternoon, apparently, the wrong one was the gardener. He had arrived quietly, pushing a rusted wheelbarrow down the gravel path, dressed in worn trousers and a faded shirt clinging to his thin frame with sweat. I had never seen him before. I assumed Lorraine had hired someone new without mentioning it to me, which wasn't unusual. She liked to make decisions without consulting anyone, especially me. I was arranging glasses of iced tea on a silver tray when I noticed him pause near the hedges. His hands trembled slightly as he leaned against his shovel. The guests, Lorraine's friends from the country club, sat beneath silk parasols, sipping chilled wine and laughing too loudly. None of them acknowledged him. Not when he coughed, not when he wiped his brow with a handkerchief that had clearly seen better days. He was invisible in plain sight. I watched Lorraine wrinkle her nose when she spotted him, then lean toward one of her friends and whisper something that made them both chuckle. It burned something inside me. The sun was relentless, and even from the shade of the veranda I felt it sting. I couldn't imagine working in it for hours. I picked up a glass of water from the tray and walked down the stone steps toward him. "Excuse me," I said softly. He looked startled, as if no one had spoken to him kindly in a long time. Up close, I noticed his eyes. They were pale gray, almost silver, and though his face was lined with age, there was something alert behind them, something observant. "You look overheated," I told him, handing him the glass. "Please, take this." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before accepting it. "Thank you, miss," he said, his voice low and steady, not rough like I expected, but refined in a way that felt oddly out of place. Kind. I almost laughed at the irony. That was the word my father used to describe me before he passed. He used to say kindness was a quiet strength, not a weakness. Lorraine disagreed. She believed kindness made you easy to overlook. The gardener drank slowly, deliberately, as if savoring more than just the water. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elena," I replied. "Elena Harper." Something flickered across his face at the mention of my last name, but it disappeared so quickly I wondered if I imagined it. "Harper," he repeated softly, as if testing the sound of it. He handed the glass back to me with careful gratitude. "Thank you, Elena." From the veranda, I could feel Lorraine's gaze drilling into my back. When I turned, she was staring openly now, her lips pressed into a thin line. Camille leaned over to whisper something to her, and they both laughed. I ignored them. I asked the gardener if he needed anything else, another drink perhaps, something to eat, but he declined politely. "You've done more than enough," he said. His eyes held mine for a moment longer than expected. Kindness has a way of returning when you least expect it. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I simply nodded and returned to my duties. But the rest of the afternoon I felt watched. Not in a threatening way, more like I was being studied, measured. When the luncheon ended and the guests departed in a parade of polished cars, Lorraine called me into the drawing room. She didn't waste time. "What exactly did you think you were doing?" she asked, her tone cool and cutting. "Giving a man water," I answered plainly. He looked like he might faint. She scoffed. "He's hired help, Elena. You don't need to play saint. It looks desperate." Desperate. The word stung. "It looks human," I replied before I could stop myself. Her eyes hardened. "You would do well to remember your place in this house." My place? I had lived there my entire life, yet somehow I was still the outsider. That evening, as the sky melted into shades of orange and violet, I walked past the gardens again. The gardener's tools were neatly stacked, but he was nowhere to be seen. I felt an odd sense of disappointment. I didn't know why his presence had affected me so much. Perhaps because he had looked at me like I mattered, like he saw me, not as Lorraine's unwanted stepdaughter, not as an inconvenience, but as a person. 2 days passed before I saw him again. This time he was standing near the old oak tree at the edge of the property, speaking quietly with a man in a dark suit. The suited man looked official, polished, entirely out of place in our modest country estate. They stopped talking when they noticed me approaching. The gardener's expression softened. "Elena," he greeted me, as if we were old acquaintances. "Good afternoon." The suited man gave me a measured nod. "Miss Harper." I felt suddenly self-conscious. "Is everything all right?" I asked. The suited man glanced at the gardener, waiting for permission to speak. The gardener gave a small nod. "We'll be in touch soon," he said cryptically, before walking toward a sleek black car parked discreetly beyond the gate. My heart thudded in confusion. "What's going on?" I asked. He studied me carefully, those silver eyes gleaming in the fading sunlight. "Tell me, Elena," he said gently, "if you discovered your life—" I barely slept that night. His words echoed in my mind over and over. "You're going to learn who truly owns this estate." I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, tracing the cracks in the plaster like they might rearrange themselves into answers. My father had always told me the estate belonged to our family for generations, that it was a symbol of legacy, of honor, of responsibility. He never once hinted that there was uncertainty surrounding it. And yet something in the gardener's voice, steady, certain, made me question everything. Morning came heavy and gray, the air thick with an approaching storm. I found Lorraine already seated at the breakfast table, flipping through her phone with impatient taps. Camille and Brooke were whispering over coffee, their manicured nails wrapped around porcelain cups. When I entered, conversation stopped. Not paused, stopped. "You look dreadful," Lorraine said without glancing up. "Did you finally realize that playing servant doesn't suit you?" I ignored her jab. "Who hired the new gardener?" I asked. Her eyes flicked to mine, sharp and calculating. "Why?" "Because I'd like to know his name." Camille snorted softly. "Why? Planning to bring him more refreshments?" Brooke giggled. I felt my cheeks warm but kept my voice steady. "I just think it's strange no one mentioned him." Lorraine set her phone down with deliberate care. "His name is Arthur," she said, "and he's temporary. The landscaping company sent him." Arthur. The name felt too simple, too ordinary for the weight he carried in my thoughts. "Which company?" I pressed. She narrowed her eyes. "Since when do you concern yourself with payroll?" I had no answer that wouldn't expose my unease, so I let it go. But inside, suspicion coiled tight around my ribs. By midday, thunder rolled across the hills, dark clouds swallowing the sky. I watched from the window as the gardener, Arthur, continued working despite the shifting weather. He moved with purpose, inspecting the stone walls, studying the structure of the house itself. Not pruning, not planting, inspecting. That was when I knew. Landscapers didn't measure foundation lines with that kind of scrutiny. I stepped outside just as the first drop of rain fell. "You're gonna get drenched," I called out. He turned slowly, as if he had been expecting me. "I've weathered worse storms," he replied calmly. There was something almost symbolic in his words. The wind picked up, tugging at my hair. "You said something yesterday," I began, forcing courage into my voice, "about learning who truly owns this estate." His expression grew serious. "Yes." "What did you mean?" For a moment, he simply watched the house behind me, its white columns stark against the darkening sky. "Tell me about your father," he said instead. The shift caught me off guard. My father? Was he a man of integrity? The question was oddly formal. "Yes," I answered without hesitation. "He believed in fairness. He valued loyalty." Arthur nodded faintly. "And his marriage to Lorraine, was that built on love?" Rain began to fall harder now, cool droplets dotting the gravel between us. "I don't know," I admitted. "After my mother died, he changed. He seemed lonely." Arthur's jaw tightened, barely perceptible. "Loneliness can cloud judgment." Lightning split the sky, followed by a crack of thunder that made me flinch. "You still haven't answered me," I said over the rising wind. "Why are you really here?" He stepped closer, close enough that I could see raindrops collecting on his lashes. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted. It was no longer gentle, it was authoritative. "Because, Eleanor Harper, your father did not own this estate." The words hit like a physical blow. "That's not true." "Legally," he continued evenly, "the estate has been held in trust under a hereditary title for over a century." "A trust?" My voice trembled. "For who?" He held my gaze steadily. "For the Duke of Ashford." The name sounded almost unreal, like something pulled from a history book. "The Duke of Ashford died decades ago," I said weakly. "Publicly," he corrected. "Yes." My heart began to pound so loudly I could hear it in my ears. "What are you saying?" Rain soaked through my blouse, cold against my skin, but I barely felt it. He reached into his worn jacket and withdrew a small leather wallet. With deliberate care, he opened it and showed me an identification card bearing a crest, ornate, unmistakably aristocratic. "Arthur Whitmore," I read softly. "Duke of Ashford." The world tilted. "That's impassable." He closed the wallet. "For years, I lived quietly under another name. The estate was entrusted to your grandfather, then to your father as caretaker, not owner." Caretaker. The word felt like betrayal. "Why would my father lie to me?" "To protect you," Arthur said firmly. "The trust stipulates that the estate transfers to the next direct blood heir of the Whitmore line upon the Duke's discretion." I stared at him, rain streaming down my face like tears. "I'm not a Whitmore." His eyes softened. "Yes, you are." Silence swallowed the space between us. "Your mother," he continued gently, "was my daughter." My knees nearly gave out. The storm roared around us, but his words were louder than thunder. "No," I whispered. "My mother's name was Isabella Harper." "Isabella Whitmore before she married," he corrected quietly. "She left the title behind for love. She chose your father against my wishes." My breath came in shallow bursts. "You're saying you're my grandfather?" He nodded once. "Yes." The simplicity of it shattered me. Why didn't I know? Because when your mother passed, your father asked me to remain distant. He feared the pressures of nobility would burden you. He wanted you to have a normal life. Normal. I almost laughed at the irony of that word. And Lorraine, I asked suddenly, does she know? Arthur's expression darkened. Lorraine has discovered fragments of the truth after your father's death. She has been persuading legal counsel to reinterpret the trust. Persuading? I echoed, attempting to claim ownership through marriage. A cold understanding settled over me. Lorraine's sudden renovations, her meticulous hosting, her obsession with appearances. She hadn't been preserving the estate, she'd been positioning herself. But if you're alive, I said slowly, then the estate is still yours. Arthur looked at the house one long moment, until I choose otherwise. Lightning flashed again, illuminating his face, not as a weary gardener, but as something far more powerful. And I have made my choice. My pulse quickened. What choice? He stepped back slightly, the rain easing as quickly as it had begun. I stood in the rain long after he walked away, my mind refusing to accept what my ears had heard. My grandfather? The Duke of Ashford, the rightful owner of the estate, and somehow, my blood. I returned to the house in a daze, my wet clothes clinging to me like the weight of a secret too large to carry alone. The hallway felt narrower than usual. The portraits of long-dead relatives lining the walls suddenly looked unfamiliar, as if I had been misreading my own history my entire life. The rain's laughter drifted from the sitting room, bright and careless. I paused outside the doorway, watching her pour tea for Camille and Brooke, as though the world were perfectly intact, as though tomorrow wouldn't change everything. "You're soaked," Lorraine said when she noticed me, her tone dripping with mild disgust. "It's only rain," I replied softly. She arched a brow. "You've been speaking to him again, haven't you?" There was something sharp in her eyes now, not curiosity, suspicion. My heartbeat quickened, but I kept my voice steady. "Yes." Camille rolled her eyes. "Honestly, Elena, you act like he's some tragic hero. He's hired help." "Is he?" I asked quietly. The question hung in the air heavier than it should have. Lorraine set her teacup down with a faint clink. "What is that supposed to mean?" I hesitated. I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure if I should confront her before the legal notices arrived. But then I remembered Arthur's words. Truth often tears things apart. "I spoke to him today," I said carefully. "He told me something interesting." Lorraine's fingers tightened around her cup, almost imperceptibly. "And what would that be?" I took a breath. "He told me this estate doesn't belong to us." The silence that followed was deafening. Camille let out a short laugh. "That's absurd." But Lorraine didn't laugh. She didn't blink. She simply stared at me with a calm that felt manufactured. "Who does it belong to, then?" she asked, her voice deceptively smooth. "The Duke of Ashford." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Brooke frowned. "I thought that title was extinct." Lorraine's composure flickered for half a second before she recovered. "It is," she said firmly. "This is nonsense. Elena, that man is manipulating you." "Is he?" "Because he had documentation." That was when the mask slipped. Her jaw tightened, her eyes darkened. "You went through his things?" "He showed me willingly." I watched her carefully, and in that moment I saw it. Not confusion, not disbelief, fear. She stood slowly, smoothing the front of her blouse as though regaining control of herself. "You are naive," she said coldly. "Men with nothing often invent stories to feel important." "He said my mother was Whitmore." The room shifted. Camille looked at Brooke. Brooke looked at Lorraine. "That's enough," Lorraine snapped. "Your mother was Isabella Harper." "Whitmore before marriage," I replied. The color drained slightly from Lorraine's face, though she tried to hide it. "Where did you hear that name?" she demanded. "From him." A long pause stretched between us. Lorraine's mind was working rapidly. I could see it calculating options, outcomes, damage control. "Elena," she said finally, her voice softening into something almost maternal. "Your father shielded you from complicated matters. You were grieving, you were young." "Shielded me from what?" "From old family disputes. That title you mentioned, it carries legal entanglements. It's best left buried." Buried? The word struck a nerve. "Why would it matter if it's extinct?" I asked quietly. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she turned toward the window, staring out at the gardens. "Some legacies bring nothing but trouble, and some people are foolish enough to chase them." I stepped closer. "Are you one of those people?" Her head snapped toward me. "Watch your tone." "No," I said, surprising even myself. "You watch yours. You've treated me like an inconvenience since father died, and now I find out there's a trust, a hereditary title. Why didn't you tell me?" Her composure cracked. "Because it was irrelevant," she snapped. "Your father was the legal caretaker. That's all that mattered." "Caretaker," I repeated slowly, "not owner." The word lingered between us like an accusation. Camille stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Mother, tell her." Lorraine inhaled sharply, regaining control. "Even if he exists," she said coldly, "marriage grants rights. I am the widow of the caretaker. I have standing." "But not blood," I said softly. The word blood felt heavier than it ever had before. She stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as a nuisance, but as a threat. "What exactly did he promise you?" she asked quietly. "Nothing," I replied honestly. "He said kindness reveals character." Her lips curled faintly. "And you believed him?" "Yes." The simplicity of my answer unsettled her more than any argument could have. For years I had been the quiet one, the compliant one, the girl who avoided conflict to keep peace. But peace built on half-truths was no peace at all. "You think this changes anything," Lorraine said sharply. "Even if he transfers ownership, do you know what it means to manage an estate of this scale? The taxes, the obligations, the social expectations?" "I'll learn." "You'll fail." The certainty in her voice stung, but it also strengthened something inside me. "Maybe," I admitted, "but it will be mine to fail." Her eyes flashed. "You ungrateful child." "Ungrateful?" I echoed. "For what? Being tolerated?" Camille gasped softly. Brooke looked on the verge of tears, but I couldn't stop now. "You've spent years reminding me I didn't belong." "Well, perhaps you were right." Her expression hardened into something almost unrecognizable. "If you think you can push me out of this house—" "I'm not pushing anyone out, but tomorrow we'll all know where we truly stand." The room fell into a brittle silence. Finally, Lorraine spoke, her voice low and dangerous. "You've made a grave mistake." "No," I said softly. "I think Father made one. He trusted the wrong person." Her hand trembled slightly at her side, but she quickly turned away. "We'll see what tomorrow brings." Indeed. That night the house felt different, charged, unsettled, waiting. I sat on my bed staring at an old photograph of my mother. Her smile was gentle, almost shy. I searched her features for traces of the Whitmore name, for clues I had missed all my life. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered into the quiet darkness. Somewhere beyond the window, the wind stirred the oak trees. And for the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider in this house. I felt like someone standing on the edge of a truth long overdue. And when morning came, everything would either crumble or finally fall into place. Morning arrived too quickly. I had barely slept, my thoughts tangling themselves into knots I couldn't loosen. When I finally rose, the house felt unnaturally quiet, like it was holding its breath. I dressed carefully, not in anything extravagant, but in something simple and composed. My reflection in the mirror looked different. Not stronger, not braver, but aware. Downstairs, Lorraine was already seated in the formal sitting room. She wore a cream suit I'd only seen her use for important meetings. Camille and Brooke sat beside her, both pale and tense. A silver tray of untouched tea rested on the table. No one spoke when I entered. At precisely 10 o'clock, a car engine sounded beyond the front gates, the deep, smooth hum of something expensive. My heart began to pound. Lorraine's fingers tightened around the armrest. The knock came 3 minutes later, firm, measured, deliberate. Our housekeeper opened the door, and I heard quiet voices in the foyer, then footsteps, more than two. Arthur entered first, no longer dressed in worn trousers and faded cotton. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit him with effortless precision. His posture was different entirely, straight, assured, commanding. Behind him followed the man in the dark suit I had seen earlier, and another older gentleman carrying a leather briefcase. The air in the room shifted immediately. Lorraine stood. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully. Arthur inclined his head slightly. "Lorraine." He did not call her Mrs. Harper. He did not offer warmth. Camille and Brooke exchanged uncertain glances. The man with the briefcase stepped forward. "Good morning. I am Charles Bennett, legal counsel representing His Grace, the Duke of Ashford." His Grace. The title sounded surreal in our sitting room. Charles placed the briefcase on the table and opened it with quiet efficiency. He removed several documents neatly bound. "We are here regarding the Ashford Estate Trust," he continued. Lorraine forced a tight smile. "I'm aware of the trust." Arthur's gaze flicked to her, cool and unreadable. "Are you?" The lawyer continued, unfazed. "The trust stipulates that custodianship of this estate was granted to the Harper family under the authority of the Duke, pending transfer to a direct blood heir upon the Duke's discretion." He looked toward me. "Miss Elena Harper, born to Isabella Whitmore Harper." Hearing my mother's full name spoken aloud like that felt like a thread being pulled through time. Lorraine's voice sharpened. "My late husband was the acting head of this estate." "Acting," Arthur repeated evenly, "not owning." The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "Upon review and confirmation of lineage documentation, His Grace has exercised his legal right to transfer full ownership and title of the estate to his granddaughter, Miss Elena Harper, effective immediately." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Camille gasped softly. Brooke's eyes filled with tears. Lorraine didn't move. She didn't blink. "That is impossible," she said coldly. "My marriage grants me legal standing." Charles shook his head politely. "Marriage to a custodian does not override hereditary stipulations outlined in the trust." Arthur stepped forward then, his presence filling the room without effort. "Lorraine, you were aware of the trust's conditions," he said calmly. She met his gaze with simmering fury. "I was aware the Duke was deceased." "You were aware he was reclusive," Arthur corrected, "not deceased." Her composure fractured. "You allowed the world to believe you were gone." "For good reason," he replied evenly. "Titles attract opportunists." The word hung heavy. Lorraine's cheeks flushed with anger. "How dare you?" Arthur's voice did not rise. "This estate was never yours to claim." The lawyer slid a document across the table toward me. "Miss Harper, if you would review and sign." My hands trembled as I approached. I glanced at Lorraine. She looked at me not with pleading, but with accusation. "You're destroying this family," she said coldly. I swallowed. "No, I'm learning the truth." Camille suddenly stood. "Mother, is it true? Did you know?" Lorraine's silence was answer enough. Brooke began to cry quietly. "You told us this house would be ours someday." Arthur's gaze softened slightly at the girls. "You will not be turned out," he said calmly. "Miss Harper has no intention of cruelty." Lorraine laughed bitterly. "You think she understands what you've handed her, the expectations, the scrutiny." Arthur looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw something steady. "She understands integrity." I picked up the pen. The weight of it felt heavier than metal. It felt like legacy. For a split second, doubt flickered. What if Lorraine was right? What if I wasn't prepared? Then I remembered the way she had treated me for years, the way she had measured my worth against convenience, the way she had smirked when I offered a tired man a glass of water. "Kindness is inherited," Arthur had said. My hand steadied. I signed. The scratch of ink against paper echoed louder than it should have. Charles collected the document with a satisfied nod. "It is done," he said simply. Done. Just like that. Lorraine sank slowly back into her chair, as though something inside her had collapsed. "You've made a grave mistake," she murmured. I looked at her, not with triumph, but with clarity. "If this house remains standing," I said quietly, "it will be because it's built on truth." Arthur turned to the lawyer. "Please provide Mrs. Harper with the formal review of her residential rights under the new ownership." Lorraine's head snapped up. "Residential rights?" The lawyer nodded. "Miss Harper has agreed to grant you 6 months residency while alternative arrangements are made." I had made that decision late last night after long reflection. This wasn't revenge. It was transition. Lorraine stared at me in disbelief. "You're offering charity?" "No," I said softly. "I'm offering dignity." The words seemed to wound her more than cruelty would have. Arthur steadied me quietly, approval unspoken but present. When the formalities concluded and the documents were secured, the men prepared to leave. Arthur lingered behind. "You handled that well," he said gently. I exhaled shakily. "I feel like the ground shifted." It did. I looked around the room, the polished floors, the portraits, the sunlight filtering through tall windows. "What happens now?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Now you learn who you truly are." For the first time since my father died, I felt something unfamiliar but welcome. It wasn't victory. It wasn't pride. It was belonging. As Arthur stepped toward the door, Lorraine spoke one last time, her voice. The silence after they left felt louder than the confrontation itself. The sitting room, once Lorraine's stage for polished gatherings and careful manipulation, now seemed smaller, like the walls had drawn inward to witness the shift in power. Camille and Brooke retreated upstairs without a word, their footsteps quick and uneven. Lorraine remained seated, staring at nothing, her hands folded too tightly in her lap. I stood across from her, unsure whether to speak or allow the quiet to settle. She finally looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, she didn't look superior. She looked cornered. "You think this is a victory," she said quietly. "It's not." I didn't answer immediately. I didn't feel victorious. I felt overwhelmed. "I never wanted a battle," I replied softly. "Then you shouldn't have started one." Her tone sharpened again, reflexively defensive. "I didn't start anything," I said. "I offered someone water." She let out a hollow laugh. "You really believe this is about kindness?" I held her gaze. "Isn't it?" She stood abruptly, pacing toward the window. Do you know what happens to estates like this when the press catches wind of a reclusive duke resurfacing, when society learns the title passed quietly to a granddaughter no one knew existed? Her words were calculated, designed to intimidate. Then I'll face it, I said calmly, just like Father did. The mention of him struck something fragile in her. She turned slowly. Your father was not equipped for the politics that came with this place. Then why didn't he step away? She hesitated. Because pride runs deep in men who inherit responsibility. I watched her carefully. Or because he believed in stewardship. The word lingered between us. She inhaled slowly, regaining composure. 6 months, she said. That's generous. It's fair. She tilted her head slightly. You think fairness will protect you? No, I answered honestly, but it will let me sleep at night. That silenced her. She didn't argue further. She simply walked out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. For the rest of the day, the house buzzed with quiet tension. Staff members moved carefully, whispering in corners. News travels fast in households like ours, faster than letters or announcements. By evening, the estate felt less like Lorraine's domain and more like uncertain territory. I wandered through the corridor slowly, touching the banister my father once polished himself, running my fingers along the carved wooden frames of portraits I now understood differently. These weren't just decorative heirlooms, they were Whitmore history. My history. I found myself in my father's old study. The room still smelled faintly of leather and paper. I hadn't entered it much since his passing. It felt sacred, untouched. I sat in his chair, heart heavy, and opened the top drawer. Inside lay documents, letters, and a small velvet box I had never noticed before. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a signet ring, engraved with the same crest I had seen on Arthur's identification card, the Whitmore crest. My breath caught. Father had kept this hidden, not destroyed, not discarded, protected. A folded letter rested beneath it. I recognized his handwriting immediately. My dearest Elena, if you are reading this, it means the truth has found you before I had the courage to reveal it myself. Please believe that every decision I made was to shield you, not deceive you. The Whitmore title is a weight, not a privilege. It carries expectations that can consume a gentle heart. I wanted you free of that burden. But if you stand now at the crossroads of inheritance, know this. You were born with both strength and kindness. Do not let one erase the other. Love always. Father. Tears blurred my vision. He hadn't lied out of greed. He hid it out of protection. I pressed the letter to my chest, grief and gratitude intertwining painfully. That evening, there was a knock at my door. It was Camille. She stood awkwardly in the hallway, her usual confidence absent. Can we talk? She asked quietly. I nodded and stepped aside. She entered, glancing around as though seeing my room for the first time. Did you know? About all of it? No, I said honestly. I learned 2 days ago. She swallowed. Mother, she mentioned the trust once after Father died. She thought if she could prove abandonment of title, the estate would legally default to her. The admission didn't surprise me. Did she ever consider telling me? Camille shook her head slowly. She said you were too sentimental, too soft. I managed a faint smile. She might not be entirely wrong. Camille looked at me, something conflicted in her eyes. Are we really leaving in 6 months? You don't have to, I said gently. I meant what I said. You'll have support during the transition. She stared at me as though trying to reconcile the girl she'd mocked and the woman now holding ownership. Why aren't you angry? she asked. I am, I admitted, but anger doesn't build anything, it only burns. She nodded slowly, absorbing that. Perhaps for the first time we were speaking without inherited tension. After she left, I stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the gardens, the same hedges where Arthur had stood days ago, the same sun that had beaten down relentlessly when I handed him that glass of water. I thought about how small the gesture had been. At least I had believed it small. But maybe kindness is never small. Maybe it is simply unnoticed until it shifts something monumental. The first week after the transfer felt like living inside a story the world was only beginning to read. The local papers broke the news before I had even finished my morning tea. Reclusive Duke resurfaces, one headline declared. Granddaughter inherits Ashford estate. Photographers gathered discreetly beyond the iron gates, hoping for a glimpse of scandal or spectacle, but there was none. I refused interviews. I refused dramatics. I focused instead on learning what stewardship truly meant. Arthur visited twice that week, not as a distant nobleman, but as a patient mentor. We sat in my father's study reviewing financial statements, maintenance records, and trust documents. The estate was larger than I had ever realized, not just the house and gardens, but acres of farmland, rental cottages, historical landmarks tied to the Whitmore lineage. Ownership is only one piece, Arthur told me gently. Responsibility is the greater portion. I listened carefully, absorbing every detail. The staff had begun addressing me differently, not overly formal, but with a subtle shift in respect. It felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. I didn't want fear or obligation from them. I wanted trust. Lorraine, meanwhile, moved through the house like a storm cloud waiting to break. She made frequent phone calls behind closed doors. She met with lawyers twice, both leaving with tight expressions and stiff handshakes. But legally, there was little she could contest. The trust was airtight. Her frustration simmered beneath carefully maintained composure. Camille had grown quieter. Brooke avoided me entirely. I sensed their loyalty torn between their mother and the new reality. I did not blame them. One afternoon, as I walked through the West Wing, an area long neglected, I found Brooke sitting alone on the windowsill. She didn't notice me at first. She was staring out at the gardens with distant eyes. "It's strange," she said softly when she realized I was there, "knowing this isn't ours anymore." I leaned against the wall, choosing my words carefully. "It was never ours," I replied gently. "Not in the way we thought." She hugged her knees. "Mother says you'll regret this, that people like us don't survive in their world." I smiled faintly. "What world?" "The aristocratic one, the charity galas, the politics." I considered that. "Maybe I won't survive it, but I don't have to become it either." She looked at me curiously. "What does that mean?" "It means legacy doesn't have to equal pretension. We can honor history without losing ourselves." Her expression softened slightly. Perhaps she was beginning to see that this transition didn't mean exile. That evening, Arthur invited me to accompany him to a small gathering in town, a quiet dinner with members of the Historical Preservation Council. It would be my first public appearance as the Whitmore heir. I stood before my mirror for a long time before leaving, not adjusting makeup, not perfecting posture, just studying the woman staring back at me. She looked the same, and yet not. The dinner was held in a modest but elegant hall. Lights glowed warmly against polished wood tables. When we entered, conversations paused, not dramatically, but noticeably. Arthur moved with practiced ease, introducing me simply. My granddaughter, Elena. No grand speeches, no displays. I shook hands, listened more than I spoke. When someone commented on the unusual nature of the title transfer, I answered honestly. It wasn't unusual, it was overdue. A few eyebrows lifted, but there was respect in their nods. I realized then that authority didn't require volume, it required steadiness. As the evening drew to a close, an older woman approached me. She studied my face with curious eyes. "You have Isabella's smile," she said quietly. My breath caught. "You knew my mother?" Briefly, she was strong-willed. A faint smile touched her lips. Kind, too. The word followed me everywhere now. Kind. Not weak, not naive. Kind. And suddenly I understood something Arthur had been showing me all along. Kindness was not softness, it was discernment. It was choosing integrity even when power tempted otherwise. When we returned to the estate, Lorraine was waiting in the foyer. She stood poised, as though rehearsed. "I hope you enjoyed your debut," she said coolly. It wasn't a debut, it was dinner. Her lips thinned. "You think humility will shield you from scrutiny." "No," I said, "but authenticity might." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You don't understand how quickly admiration turns to envy." "Maybe," I answered, "but envy doesn't frighten me as much as dishonesty." Her eyes flashed. "You always mistook morality for superiority." The accusation lingered. I considered responding sharply, but I chose restraint. "No," I said softly, "I mistake morality for peace." For a moment, something flickered in her gaze, perhaps recognition that the battle she expected was not unfolding the way she planned. She turned away without another word. Later that night, I found Arthur in the library reviewing documents. He looked up as I entered. "How was it?" I asked. "Educational," I replied with a faint smile. He chuckled softly. "You handled yourself well." I hesitated before speaking. "Did you ever regret stepping away from the title?" He leaned back thoughtfully. "No, but I regretted the distance it created with Isabella." My heart tightened. "You loved her?" "Very much." His voice grew quiet, but pride blinded me, then fear. "After she chose your father, I believed keeping distance was protection." "Was it?" I asked gently. He met my eyes. "No, it was cowardice." The honesty surprised me. He wasn't flawless. He wasn't mythic. He was human. And perhaps that was what made him worthy of the title more than the title made him worthy. "I don't want to repeat that," I said quietly. "I don't want fear guiding my decisions." He nodded slowly. "Then don't let it." Silence settled comfortably between us. This wasn't about reclaiming grandeur. It was about reclaiming truth. As I walked back to my room, I paused in the hallway outside Lorraine's door. I could hear her speaking softly, no longer sharp, but tired. "We'll need to adjust," she was saying to someone on the phone. "Yes, I understand." There was no venom in her tone tonight, only resignation. For the first time, I felt something unexpected toward her. Not triumph, not anger, but empathy. She had built her identity around control, and control had slipped through her fingers. I didn't hate her for that. I pitied the fragility beneath her ambition. The estate slept quietly around us, its history settling into new alignment. I stood at the window once more, gazing over the moonlit gardens. The same place where this began, the same soil where a simple act of kindness had unraveled decades of. The weeks that followed did not explode into scandal the way Lorraine had predicted. Instead, they unfolded slowly, like pages turning in a book that had been waiting years to be read. I immersed myself in the estate's operations, meetings with tenants, farm inspections, restoration plans for the West Wing that had been ignored for over a decade. I listened to the staff's suggestions rather than issuing commands. I asked questions I once would have been too timid to voice. And gradually something shifted, not just in the estate, but in me. One afternoon, I walked through the lower gardens where the old fountain had cracked from years of neglect. The stone cherub at its center had lost part of its wing. I remembered playing there as a child before Lorraine redirected resources toward more impressive renovations near the front drive. Appearances had always mattered more than authenticity. I ran my fingers along the broken stone and imagined restoring not just its structure, but its purpose. A fountain was not meant to decorate silently, it was meant to flow. Lorraine approached quietly from behind. "You're planning to repair it," she observed. I turned to face her. "Yes." She crossed her arms. "It won't increase property value." "Not everything is about value," I replied gently. "Some things are about history." She studied me carefully. There was less hostility in her gaze now, more calculation, but also something else, fatigue. "You're changing things," she said. "Only what needs changing." A pause lingered between us before she spoke again. "Camille received an offer from a firm in the city. She's considering it." "That's wonderful," I said sincerely. "It's far from here." "Maybe that's good," I replied. Lorraine's lips pressed together, but she didn't argue. For the first time, our conversations felt less like battlefields and more like uneasy negotiations. 2 evenings later, Arthur requested I join him in the library. He stood by the fireplace holding a small wooden box. "There's something I should have given you sooner," he said quietly. I approached, heart steady but curious. He opened the box to reveal an antique pocket watch. Its gold casing bore the Whitmore crest. "This belonged to your great-grandfather," Arthur explained. "It has passed from duke to heir for generations." He held it out to me. I hesitated. "Are you certain?" He smiled faintly. "Titles transfer by document. Legacy transfers by choice." I accepted the watch carefully. It felt warm in my palm despite the cool room. "I don't want to be defined by it," I admitted softly. "Then don't," he replied. "Let it remind you of time, not status. Time humbles all of us." His words lingered long after I returned to my room. That night, as I wound the watch gently and listened to its steady ticking, I realized something profound. Power fades, wealth shifts, but time reveals character, and character was the one inheritance no trust could dictate. The next morning brought unexpected tension. A luxury car arrived at the gates unannounced. Out stepped a sharply dressed man in his early 30s, confidence radiating from every step. He introduced himself as Victor Langley, an investor who had previously discussed development contracts with Lorraine. Mrs. Harper indicated portions of the estate might be available for commercial expansion, boutique hotels, perhaps a private members club. My stomach tightened. "That arrangement is no longer under consideration," I replied calmly. He smiled politely but condescendingly. "With respect, Miss Harper, such developments could secure long-term financial growth." "At the expense of farmland and historical grounds," I countered. "Progress requires sacrifice." "Integrity requires boundaries," I responded evenly. His smile faltered slightly. "You're young. You'll learn that sentiment doesn't sustain wealth." "And you'll learn," I replied quietly, "that wealth without sentiment isn't worth sustaining." There was a long pause before he inclined his head stiffly. "If you reconsider, my office remains available." After he left, I found Lorraine waiting in the foyer. She'd overheard. "That deal would have secured stability for decades. It would have erased history for profit. History doesn't pay taxes." "No," I agreed, "but it builds identity." She stared at me with something close to disbelief. "You would risk financial strain to preserve nostalgia." "I would rather adapt responsibly than dismantle permanently." Her shoulders sagged slightly. "You truly are your mother's daughter." The statement wasn't an insult this time. It was almost reluctant acknowledgement. I met her gaze steadily. "I'll take that as a compliment." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, unexpectedly, she said, "I underestimated you." The admission caught me off guard. "Why?" I asked gently. "Because I mistook kindness for weakness," she replied quietly. The honesty in her voice felt unfamiliar, but real. I considered responding triumphantly. I chose something else. "Kindness can be firm," I said softly. She nodded faintly, as though filing the lesson away. The 6-month arrangement began to feel less like exile and more like transition. Camille accepted her position in the city, Brooke applied to a university abroad, Lorraine spent more time reviewing her own financial independence rather than plotting legal challenges. The house, once tense with rivalry, began to breathe again. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in hues of gold and lavender, I walked through the gardens and found Arthur seated beneath the oak tree where he had first questioned me. "You handled Langley well," he remarked without looking down. "You heard? News travels quickly in small towns." I sat beside him on the bench. Was I foolish to refuse? He shook his head slowly. "Leadership is not about pleasing investors. It's about protecting legacy." I exhaled softly. Lorraine admitted I underestimated me. He smiled faintly. "Most people underestimate quiet strength." Silence settled comfortably between us. The oak leaves rustled overhead. "Grandfather," I said carefully, still growing used to the word, "when you tested me that day, did you already know?" He glanced at me with silver eyes that mirrored my own. "I suspected, but suspicion is not certainty." "And if I hadn't offered water?" He smiled gently. "Then I would have waited." The simplicity of that answer struck me. He hadn't engineered fate. He had observed it. And kindness spoke louder than heritage. As 6 months passed more quickly than I expected. Change, I learned, does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it settles like morning light, gradual, undeniable, reshaping everything without noise. Camille moved to the city in early spring. We stood in the front drive as her car was loaded. She hugged Brooke first, then hesitated before turning to me. "I don't think I ever said this," she admitted quietly, "but you handled all of this better than I would have." I smiled gently. "You would have handled it your way." She gave a small laugh, probably with lawsuits and dramatic speeches. There was warmth between us now, not quite sisterhood, but no longer rivalry. "Take care of the fountain," she added softly. "It was my favorite when we were little." "I will," I promised, and I meant it. Brooke left 2 months later for university abroad. She cried in my arms before stepping into her taxi. "Don't let Mother isolate herself," she whispered. "I won't." When the gates closed behind her, the estate felt quieter, but not emptier, more balanced. Lorraine remained for the full 6 months. True to my word, I ensured her transition was dignified. We met twice with financial advisors. I transferred a portion of liquid assets allocated under Father's estate to secure her independence. She did not thank me, but she did not fight me either. On her final evening in the house, she asked me to join her in the drawing room, the same room where she had once questioned my place. She stood near the fireplace, hands clasped. "I underestimated your resolve," she said without preamble. I remained silent, allowing her space. "When I married your father, I believed security came from possession, from control. I thought if I could secure this estate, I would never feel vulnerable again." Her voice faltered slightly. "But control is fragile. It shatters easily." I watched her carefully. This was not the Lorraine who whispered insults behind porcelain cups. This was a woman confronting her own reflection. "You could have humiliated me," she said quietly. "You didn't." "I didn't need to," I replied softly. The truth was enough. A long pause stretched between us before she added, "Your mother would be proud." The words landed deeper than any apology. I felt my throat tighten. "Thank you," I whispered. She nodded once, composed as ever, and the conversation ended not with reconciliation, but with understanding. The next morning she left without spectacle, no dramatic farewell, no bitterness, just the quiet closing of a chapter. When the gates shut behind her car, I stood in the foyer alone. The house did not echo with triumph, it exhaled with relief. That afternoon, I walked the grounds slowly, past the restored fountain now flowing freely, its cherub's wing repaired with careful craftsmanship, past the farmland where new crops had begun to grow under sustainable plans we implemented, past the oak tree where a weary gardener once stood beneath relentless sun. Arthur waited there now, leaning lightly on his cane. Age had softened his stride further, but his eyes remained clear. "It's quieter," he observed. "Peaceful," I corrected. He smiled faintly. "You've done well." "I've tried to listen more than lead." "That is leadership," he said gently. We sat together beneath the oak tree as golden light filtered through the leaves. "Do you regret revealing yourself?" I asked after a moment. He shook his head slowly. "No, I regret waiting so long." His gaze drifted toward the house. "Your mother believed this estate could be more than a symbol. She believed it could serve the community. She and I argued about it endlessly." I looked at him in surprise. "Argued?" "Oh, yes," he chuckled softly. "She had your stubbornness." A warmth spread through me. "Then I suppose I come by it honestly." "You do." Silence settled comfortably before he spoke again. "The title will pass to you formally upon my death." I stiffened. "Grandfather, do not look so alarmed," he said gently. "Time is inevitable. The watch I gave you is proof of that." I touched the pocket watch resting in my coat. "I don't want the title to overshadow the work." "Then redefine the title," he replied simply. "Make it represent service, not status." The idea felt powerful, not rebellion, but evolution. As weeks turned to months, we began community restoration projects, opening portions of the gardens for public access, hosting educational programs in the West Wing, restoring historical landmarks once hidden behind exclusivity. The estate became less fortress and more foundation. News articles shifted tone. "Modern air redefines tradition," one read. I ignored the praise deliberately as I had ignored criticism. This was not about image, it was about intention. One late afternoon, as I oversaw volunteers planting trees along the southern boundary, an elderly man approached quietly. He wore simple clothes, his posture slightly stooped. "Miss Harper?" I asked. "Yes." "I used to work these fields decades ago, when your grandfather still walked them himself." I smiled. "He still does." He chuckled softly. "Your mother once brought us lemonade during harvest. She said no one should work in the heat without refreshment." My breath caught. The memory echoed so clearly, like history repeating itself. "She was right," I said gently. The man studied me with kind eyes. "It seems you are too." After he left, I stood alone under the open sky, emotion rising unexpectedly. It had never just been about water. It had been about dignity, about seeing someone others ignored, about choosing humanity without knowing who was watching. That single act had unraveled deception, restored legacy, and redefined my life. But more importantly, it had revealed who I already was. The estate flourished not because I inherited it, but because I honored it. Arthur's health began to decline gently as autumn approached. We spent long evenings in the library speaking not of titles, but of family, of mistakes, of forgiveness. One night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, he looked at me thoughtfully. "You were the only one who offered water," he said quietly. because you knew who you were." I felt tears gather but did not let them fall. "You didn't need to test me," I whispered. "Life tests us all," he replied gently.